Hello, and welcome to the Gratz at Home webinar series. Today's presentation is the fifth in our series of six. My name is Lori Cohen, and I'm the Director of Non-Credit and Adult Learning Programs at Gratz College. We're delighted that you're joining us for this webinar. During this presentation, please make sure that your volume is turned on and up. You should see a black bar at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the chat button in that bar, you'll be able to type in questions or comments. I'll see your questions and I'll ask them at the end of the presentation or during the presentation for tonight. You can also adjust the size of your screen and you can move the windows around if they're in your way for some reason. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dina Maven. As many of you know, Dina is the director of the Jewish Community High School at Gratz. She's our Hebrew coordinator and also a resident linguist, and she'll be in that capacity today. Dina will be speaking about the ways in which the English language has changed over time and also where it's going in the future. She will also ask you, our participants at home, questions during the presentation, so make sure you stay awake. Welcome, Ms. Maven.
Thank you, Lori, and welcome everybody. I want to begin with two observations. The first is that all living languages change. Dead languages do not change. In fact, that is the actual definition of a dead language. It's a language that no longer changes. New words are not coming into it. The pronunciation hasn't changed. Nobody's speaking it. That's a dead language. Second observation is that all language changes tend to make the older generations feel crazy a little bit. They have the feeling that the language is going to the dogs, that words are being misapplied, that the younger generation is destroying the grammar, and so on. Things bothered my English teachers because they were changing. Things borrowed my English teachers' English teachers because they were changing. And it's kind of a sign as we get older that certain changes within the language start to bother us. But it turns out that this is a normal process with all languages, that change is actually healthy. It's a good sign because it's a sign that the language is alive and well. And you should know both of these observations apply to English at every stage of its development. So the first thing that you should see is that we have a little timeline here on the history of the English language. It's made up of several different stages. It involves a series of migrations, 5 full-scale invasions, a cultural revolution, and the influx of immigrants. And at each stage in this, new things have happened in the language, changes have happened within the language. The oldest inhabitants of England were Neolithic hunter-gatherers, and about 4,400 years ago, the first migration began to take place across Europe that actually affected England. We don't really know where the Neolithic folks came from. Obviously, it was a migration, but it was so long ago that we have no way of knowing how it took place. But this migration of about 4,400 years ago had to do with a group known as the Beaker people, or members of the Beaker culture. This was a group that was living in Central Europe. Their ancestors likely came from the Eurasian steppes, and the group continued to migrate west. They finally arrived in Britain, as I said, about 4,400 years ago, at a time when Britain was still connected to continental Europe. The people who were part of the Beaker culture can be identified by the kind of pottery that they created, distinctive pottery that was shaped like a bell with these intricate incisions in it before it was baked. And we know from DNA and from the artifacts that have been found in their burial sites that over the span of several hundred years, the Beaker people replaced the older Neolithic group that had been in Britain for a long time and who were responsible for such things as building Stonehenge and the other big rock monuments. The next migration takes place starting around 1000 BCE. These are the Celtic migrations. Celtic is the name, Celts are the names that the Greeks gave this group of people, who were first identified by the Greek geographer Hecataeus of Miletus in about 517 BCE. This group, the Celts, appeared in and around Austria, and they spread all across Europe. Their exact geographic spread is actually a matter of debate, especially as it relates to the British Isles. But we do know that they did migrate into at least parts of Britain. What is not disputed is that their language became common throughout Britain. It's present in Welsh Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, Breton, Cornish, and Manx. Cornish and Manx being two recent revivals. The other thing we know is that not much of the Celtic influence remained in English. Really, a couple of grammatical features, using ing to denote a continuous tense, doing, baking, making, seeing, and so on. Also, the do periphrasis, which is, it's using verb forms of the verb do as an auxiliary kind of verb. He did go slowly, she does speak quickly, and so on. As far as vocabulary is concerned, only a couple of words remain, mostly geographical or geological features like crag and tor, which both describe rock formations, and place names. The name Avon means river, and that is the name of a place in Britain, also in New Jersey, as it turns out. Also, the word Doifur, which means water, morphs into the word Dover, the place name Dover. The next group to come into play are the Romans. They tried to invade Britain under Julius Caesar in about 55, 54 BCE. Julius Caesar failed completely at his task of trying to invade, but the Romans finally did get there about 100 years later or so under the Emperor Claudius. They succeeded in invading Britain. They created lots of road systems, as the Romans did wherever they went. They took possession of a lot of agricultural products, as the Romans did wherever they went. And they tried very hard to subdue the local inhabitants, as the Romans did wherever they went. They were less successful in Britain than they were in lots of places, and had to actually finally force the Celtic groups into the fringe areas, mostly in the highlands of northern England and Scotland. And actually Hadrian, who subsequently becomes emperor much later on, Hadrian, who was the commander of Britain for a while, he built a huge wall to try to keep the people at bay. Not much has come into English or remained in English from the Latin of that particular time. Again, place names tend to be common, and in this instance, the Latin word castrum, which means camp, morphed into the word Chester, as in Chester County, or Manchester, Winchester, Westchester, and so on. The Romans abandoned England kind of quickly. The Roman Empire was under attack, and they had to pull all of their troops out of the furthest reaches of the empire to kind of defend Rome. So they left the Britons kind of to their own devices, which lasted for about 40 years. 40 years in, the Germanic tribes start to invade. These are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And their dialects of medieval German eventually morphed into what we know as Old English. So Old English, the German influence was huge in the language. It's almost impossible to create a sentence in English without using some word of Anglo-Saxon origin. And everyday words, I have a short list. This is a tiny, tiny drop of the number of words that come into English from these Germanic tribes. Very much a part of English that we know today, and covering pretty much every facet of life. This famous quote from Winston Churchill about the Battle of Britain. All of the words in this quote, except one, are of Anglo-Saxon origin. Only the word surrender is Latin. So at some point during the Anglo-Saxon reign over Britain, we have a cultural revolution. And this takes place in about 595, when Pope Gregory I sent a missionary to convert the heathens in Britain to Christianity. The man he chose for that job was St. Augustine. He led a delegation that landed in the Kingdom of Kent, which was ruled by the Saxon king Ethelbert. Now, that particular king was probably chosen, and that place was chosen because he had formerly married a Christian princess named Bertha, whom he allowed to continue practicing Christianity. So the Pope's delegation arrives, Augustine arrives, the king grants them permission to preach in his capital. His capital, of course, was Canterbury. He gave them land to erect a monastery just outside the city walls, and he himself converted to Christianity and allowed huge numbers of his followers to convert also, which happened on Christmas Day in 597. At this particular point, this little cultural revolution brings in a number of vocabulary from Hebrew, Latin, Greek into English. What's interesting is that words like amen and Sabbath, sabbatical, jubilee, these are all ecclesiastical terms that come from Hebrew. Many, many, many more words come in from Hebrew a few centuries later when the Bible is translated into English, and that gives us words like cinnamon. The word cinnamon in English actually comes from Hebrew, and it came in as a result of biblical translations. Behemoth, cherub, manna, these kinds of words came into English because the Bible was translated, and rather than trying to find a different word, they simply borrowed the word from Hebrew. Next, we have another invasion. The Vikings arrive in Britain in about 793 CE. That was their first invasion. They invade, they get thrown out, they invade, they get thrown out. This goes on for a while. Their final attempt to hold Britain is in 1066, when they actually lose the battle to William the Conqueror, the Norman king, who comes in and becomes King of England after the Battle of Hastings. But the Vikings had a really interesting effect on English. We have a few words that come in from Norse, things like saga and sauna. Those kinds of words come in from the Vikings. But the biggest effect they had was on the grammar of English. Up until this point, English was a case-driven language, as is German, as is Latin, as is French. If you've studied a European language, you know about case endings and how they indicate the different grammatical role that a word plays within a sentence. The Viking languages, the Norse languages, don't work that way. They rely on word order to indicate what the relationship is in the sentence, what relationship the word has. And that took its effect on English under their reigns. The only thing that English retains cases on are personal pronouns. I, my, and mine, me. The only cases that we have are in the personal pronouns. That was under the influence of the Vikings. 1066 is the final invasion. This is when William the Conqueror defeats King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, ushers in Norman French rule to England. And this brought tremendous changes to the language. First of all, the vocabulary explodes in English, vocabulary from Latin, Greek, and Norman French. Two phases happened during that time. Two phases of change in the language happen. The first occurs between 1066 and 1250, when about 900 words come into English from French. And here we have an interesting paradox. It has to do with the status of the language. Because the French were the ruling class, French had a higher status than the old Anglo-Saxon did. And it shows up when we look at certain word pairs. English is the only language I know of where there is a different word for the animal and for the meat that that animal gives us. So we have steer and beef. Steer, of course, is an Anglo-Saxon word. Beef is a Norman French word. Sheep, Anglo-Saxon. Mutton, French. Hog, Anglo-Saxon. Pork, Latin. The second phase comes after 1250, and this is when the floodgates open. Partly what happened was the Normans themselves, who had been speaking French at court, decided that it was time to start speaking English. And so they started to speak English, they adopted it, and they brought in tons and tons of their own French words because they lacked the vocabulary for certain things. And because of this, about 10,000 words entered English from French and Latin primarily after 1250. So that's kind of the ghost of English past. And I thought we'd pause here for a moment and see if we have any questions.
Well, hi everyone, this is Lori again, and I'm going to get the ball rolling with a few questions so far that have come up. And the first one that I want to ask is, well, if the Celts were in Britain for such a long time, I don't understand, why aren't there more words of Celtic origin in English?
This is a great question. It's a great question, and one we don't really know the answer to, except for two things. The Celts were pushed to the fringes of the British Isles. Scotland, Wales, Ireland. That's where the Gaelic languages have really continued to flourish in a fairly continuous way. But English takes place and grows in England. And England the Celts were really wiped out of England. They were either forced out or they were killed. And we know that some of the Saxon kings went to great lengths to destroy Celtic presence in England. There are tales of the Druids, who were the leaders, the religious leaders of the Celts, the Druids being hunted down and killed. So because they were pushed to the fringes, not much of their language remained in the mainland where all of the other changes were taking place.
Thank you very much. I'm going to follow that up with a second question. You also mentioned that immigrants brought a lot of new words into English. Can you give an example of when that happened?
Yeah, it happens constantly. I'll give you a couple of examples from Britain. One is because the British Empire, right? Britain goes into colonial territory. They are the great colonizers of every place. One of the places they colonize is North America. In North America, the British settlers run headlong into the Native Americans, their language, and also things that are native only to North America. So, for example, there's an animal. We still find them today. They look like they're wearing a bandit's mask. They have really great dexterous paws and hands, and they have rings around their tail. The Native American word for this creature was a raccoon. And that word entered English because of colonialism to the States. Another word that entered English the same way is the word canoe. This was a special kind of ship that the Native Americans created and used. It was unknown in Europe until after colonial America. At the same time, you have colonization taking place all over Asia, the sub-Indian continent, for example, Indian subcontinent. And you get a huge number of Pakistani and Indian immigrants who move to England. And they bring with them all kinds of words like curry and chutney. These are words that come from Indian languages that enter into English because immigrants bring them with them. And in America, we have tons of those as well.
Thank you, Dina. I do appreciate that. Okay, I think it's time for us to continue on.
Okay. So one of the things that we can learn from everything about the history of English is that it really illustrates the first rule of linguistics, and that is languages change. Languages change as they are used, and they change in terms of vocabulary, they change in terms of grammar, and they change in terms of pronunciation. New words are built, old words go out, all sorts of things happen, but it's constantly in change. There are some predictable forces that create those changes and that shape the language. One of them is new technology. We know this. All of us are constantly dealing on a daily basis with new words that didn't exist a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and so on. GPS is a great example of this. We all know what GPS navigation is. I would wager 10 years ago, most of us didn't have a clue about it. New technology creates new vocabulary. Cultural exchanges create new vocabulary. I mentioned the settlers coming to the US, coming to North America, and having cultural exchanges with the Native Americans. Those kind of exchanges go on all the time. We see them in trade negotiations and trade agreements. Different groups of people, different parts of the planet, they have different products and different technologies. And when those two cultures get together, they exchange cultures, they exchange technology, and they exchange words. Wars and invasions have a profound effect on language. And then just using language every day over time creates additional changes. We'll see some examples of that as we go through this section. So starting with vocabulary, there are really 3 different ways that languages expand their vocabularies. And all languages do all 3 of these things, but they do them to varying degrees. So one way is expanding existing roots within the language. Hebrew does this constantly. This is Hebrew's favorite way of creating new vocabulary, is to take something from its existing root system and expand it. German, on the other hand, is the world's great compounding language. German will take 3, 4, sometimes even 5 words and smash them together to create a new word. Compounding is done a lot in English, but German is the master compounder. And borrowing. This is a picture of my favorite thing at Ellis Island. This is the language tree. It's this big green wooden tree, and each branch is a word that was borrowed from some other language that is now commonly used in English. So I want to actually stop for a second and thank you all for participating in the little survey that we did earlier this week. The first question that pops up here is, how many languages has English borrowed from? And the choices were 50, 150, 250, and 350. So I can tell you the results of the survey. 50% of you said that English has borrowed from 50 different languages. 20% of you said that English has borrowed from 150 different languages. Nobody said that it's borrowed from 250, and 30% of you said that it had borrowed from 350, and the 30% is absolutely correct. English has borrowed from more languages than any other language I can think of. And in fact, it's estimated that 80% of all English vocabulary comes from somewhere else, which is a huge amount of vocabulary borrowed from someplace. Yeah, Lori, another question.
Hi, Dina. We do have a question from one of our participants. I don't know that it's directly related to this, but it seemed like a good place to pause.
Okay.
So speaking of change, formal writing would have used he or she or his or hers. People are more comfortable now with they, even in the singular, rather than she, he, or he, she. What is the current thinking of the use of the singular, but without specifying a gender?
Well, there's all kinds of influences factoring into that at the moment. We see this with teenagers, actually. This is one of those interesting changes currently going on. Teenagers now ask each other, what is your pronoun? Is it he? Is it she? Is it they? Is it? Because there is a growing awareness, especially among that generation, about the needs for transgender people to be included. And some transgender folks don't believe in being either he or she. They don't think it's a binary system at all. They think there's a spectrum, and so they want a different pronoun. Kids are doing this constantly. But the shift from he and she to they, that actually started long before transgender issues came to the fore in America. What's the thinking on it? Well, part of the thinking is it's a change. It happens. Language changes. I would say that in formal writing, however, that change has not happened. Formal writing still tends to keep singular pronouns gendered and plural pronouns plural. And if you really want to make something plural in a formal written passage, then you make it plural. Instead of saying a student, he likes this or she likes that, you say students, they like this.
Thank you, Dina. So following up with that question, on a related note, why does English use you for each singular and plural? Hebrew and other languages have a different word or suffix for the singular you versus the plural of you.
That's a really good question, and German does the same kind of thing. In German, the word ihr, meaning they, also shows up in one of the case endings, one of the different cases in German. So different languages do this differently, and I'm not sure there's any rhyme or reason for why English does it the way that it does.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
And I think no more questions for now, but I'll certainly let you know if any more come up.
Okay, good. So we're talking about changes in language, and so we're going to look at things about words, individual words. New words come into the language. Vocabulary is incredibly permeable, meaning this is something that changes faster than anything else in the language. New words get added. Once upon a time, the word hack was something you did with an axe. Now it is something you do with a computer. And the person who does it is a hacker, and they may attend a hackathon. This is a totally new use of words. Hackathon is a brand new word. Selfie is relatively new. Zoodle, this is those noodles that you make out of zucchini. That's a brand new concept. New words are added all the time. At the same time, old words get discarded. So these are some old English words that no longer are in use. Apricity, which means a cold winter day, but when the sun is shining, how warm it feels. That's a word from the 1620s. Brabble, this is a great word. I think we should revive it. It means a rather loud argument over something completely inconsequential. It's a great word. Snout fair. It means someone who's good looking. It comes from the 1500s. I have no idea why. Snowbrouth, which also dates to the 1590s. It refers to freshly melted snow. Now, this one, I really think we need to bring back. Snollygoster. A snollygoster, this word comes from the 19th century from American slang. It means a shrewd, unprincipled person, especially a politician. I am in favor of bringing this word back. And then there's zenzik, which means the power of 8. In the 16th century, when this word actually was in use, people would say, it doth represent the square of squares quite squarely. Nice. Vocabulary acquisition is actually the last window of opportunity in language learning. The first window is pronunciation. It closes first. The second window is grammar. It closes second. Vocabulary never closes. And that's because we are genetically predisposed to create words and to have new words come into our usage, into our language. Because it's the last window to close, it's the reason that vocabulary learning is so much easier than grammar learning in terms of second language acquisition. Now, some of the variations in vocabulary are based on regions. So after living in New Jersey, I grew up in the West, okay, in the Rocky Mountain, Intermountain West. After living in New Jersey for a number of years, I went home over winter break. And I said to my mom, do you have any soda in the house? Because I was really thirsty. So I asked her if she had any soda. And she said, oh, yes, I think I do. And she reached up into her cupboard and pulled out a box of Arm & Hammer baking soda. And I looked at her and I said, well, that's lovely, but not quite what I had in mind. I was hoping maybe for a Diet Coke. The reason is, and I had forgotten, that there are different words for the generic of soft drinks used in different parts of the country. And where I grew up, a good 80% of the population calls that thing pop rather than soda. But I had been living in a region of the country where everybody called it soda. So this is one of those classic regional word differences. Soda versus pop, and in the South, for whatever reason, it's all called Coke. This is our second question on the survey was, what do you call casual footwear? Do you call it gym shoes, tennis shoes, kicks? 100% of you said sneakers. Nobody in the survey called it gym shoes. And that's really quite in keeping with the geographical distribution. If you look, the entire Northeast calls these things sneakers. The rest of the country, it varies. This is a really interesting one. Somehow South Florida ended up like the North. We have no idea how this happened. It is a question of, what do you call a group of people? Do you call them you guys, you, y'all? In the Deep South, it's all y'all. Gotta love it. But in South Florida, for reasons that can't explain, it's you guys, just like it is in the North. This one I had never heard of. I saw this map and I said, this is crazy. This can't be real. I was wrong. This is totally real. The thing that you have in the hallway at the school where you can go and get a drink of water, is it a water fountain, a drinking fountain, or a bubbler? I had never heard of it called a bubbler, but one of my colleagues here at Gratz, who works in my office, She happens to be from New England. And she said, well, it's called a bubbler, of course. I said, okay. Somehow, Rhode Island, a little chunk of Massachusetts, and Wisconsin refer to this thing as a bubbler. Everybody else uses one of the other two terms. This was also from our survey. What do you call this kind of sandwich? So I asked this question because recently Danny Pommel's on NBC Sports talked about a Phillies player trying to be a hero at the end of the game, trying to win the game in the bottom of the ninth inning. But as Danny said, he was nothing but a sandwich. This is a reference to a teenage young adult fiction book called A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich. And it's a question of what do you call a sandwich that is made up of cold cuts, usually on a long roll, cold cuts, vegetables, some kind of sauce. And in different parts of the country, it's called different things. Some places, looks like Connecticut, calls it a wedge. New York City and Long Island refer to it as a hero, which is what the title of the book comes from. Almost all of New England calls it a grinder. Parts of Maine and the northern part of New Hampshire and Vermont refer to it as an Italian sandwich. And the whole rest of the country calls it a sub. So New York and Philly, you are alone in having different names for this. Hoagie and sub. So the question was, what kind of a sandwich was Danny referring to? 27% of you said it was a ham sandwich. 9% said a tuna sandwich. 9% said a cheesesteak, and 55% said a hoagie, and the 55% was absolutely correct. A hero is a hoagie, is a wedge, is a grinder, is a sub. In addition to there being different terms for things across the country, sometimes word meanings change over time, and sometimes those changes are pretty dramatic. So in 1666, September of 1666, a huge fire broke out in London, burned for 4 days, destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 churches. I mean, it was a mess, and it burned St. Paul's Cathedral down. It's been estimated that 70,000 of the city's 80,000 residents lost their homes in this fire. So Charles II was the reigning monarch of the day. He absolutely insisted that St. Paul's had to be rebuilt, and he hired the leading architect of the day, Sir Christopher Wren, to do the renovations. In his book, Crazy English, Richard Lederer wrote that when St. Paul's was completed in 1710, the reigning monarch of the day, Queen Anne, took a tour of the cathedral and pronounced it awful, artificial, and amusing. And Sir Christopher, it is told, was delighted with the royal compliment. Now, I have heard this story. It's almost certainly apocryphal, because sometimes it's said that James II did this tour, sometimes it's Queen Anne, sometimes it's Charles. There are different kings and queens attributed with making this statement, but what is correct is that the word meaning was different, because in those days, our mouse go in here. In those days, awful meant awesome, inspiring awe. Artificial meant that it was a great artifice, it was artistic. And amusing meant that it came from the muses. And we know that in the actual written warrant that Charles II wrote demanding the rebuilding of the cathedral, he described it as awful and artificial. That's what he wanted. He wanted it to be awful and artificial. So we know that the story has a kernel of truth in it. We just don't know exactly how it played out, if in fact those words were used. So now that we've talked about vocabulary, are there any questions at this juncture?
Well, we do have a few questions here. So why does English borrow so many words?
Good question. I haven't actually found anyone who can answer that question, but I have a theory about it. And my theory is that you draw a parallel between language and a small child. We know that the kinds of things that happen in early childhood have a huge effect on how that child will be later in life. So I think the same thing may happen with language. The early experience of a language may set a certain kind of course for its development later on. We know England was a place that everybody wanted. I mean, if you think about the English countryside, it's beautiful, it's lush, it's green, great agriculture, lots of good minerals buried in its hills. This was a very desirable place for lots of different conquering tribes. And each one of them swooped in and brought huge changes to the language. So I suspect that the early experience of the English language kind of set a tone for it to borrow.
Thank you. Can you tell me some of the other languages English has borrowed words from?
Yeah, I actually have a list.
Oh.
In order: Latin, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Scandinavian, Japanese, Arabic, Portuguese, Sanskrit, Russian, Maori, Hindi, Hebrew, Persian, Malay, Urdu, Irish, Afrikaans, Yiddish, Chinese, Turkish, Norwegian, Zulu, and Swahili. And that's less than 10% of the 350 languages.
Wow, can you do that in alphabetical order now?
No, I barely can do the list. But some of them are really interesting, and words that you might not actually imagine come from elsewhere. For example, language. The word language is actually Latin. The word justice and science are Latin. Kindergarten, that actually makes sense. That's a German word, right? Remember the compounding, Kinder and Garten, we get kindergarten. But also pretzel, poodle, and noodle are all German. Spanish, we get things like canyon and tornado. Who knew that those words were actually originally from Spanish? From Dutch, we get great words like yacht, easel, landscape, sketch, booze, and coleslaw. Really interesting collection. Hebrew, we get all kinds of crazy things like cinnamon, who knew, and camel. Portuguese gives us albino and dodo and fetish and tempura, of all things. Crazy stuff. Maori, we get words like kiwi, which makes sense. Kiwi is a fruit from New Zealand. Remember that whole cultural exchange piece. So words come in as new products come in.
Thank you. I'll tell you, I'm really enjoying talking about this. It's kind of funny.
It is funny.
And I also enjoyed about how the different meanings of words have changed over time. Can you give us some more fun examples?
Yeah, I'll give you two.
Okay.
Two in English. So the first one is bad. Now the word bad, most of us would think is the opposite of good. But at key points in the development of the language, it's been a synonym. Originally, in Anglo-Saxon, bad meant something that was really excellent. And now we can say, oh, Scott, that is one bad hat you're wearing, meaning good. So that's one example. Another one is the word ask, which moves back and forth constantly between ask and ax. Originally in Anglo-Saxon, to pose a question was oxen. But for some reason, people using the words quickly in their speech, those letters shifted, those sounds shifted, and it went from ox to ask. Now in America, we're seeing the reversal of this. There's a whole large community within the United States that has trouble with saying sk. So instead of saying ask, they ask questions. Something that constantly shifts back and forth.
Very interesting. Thank you. I guess we're ready to move on then.
Okay. So the next category we're going to look at is pronunciation. And this is something that varies greatly from place to place. It's another way that languages change. And these classifications are based on looking at pronunciation of many different words and connecting various key variations to specific geographical regions. So, question number one is, what is it that is made out of hot sugar with a little butter and cream? It's the kind of topping, the kind of coating that you get on popcorn in Cracker Jack. Is it caramel, 2 syllables, caramel, 3 syllables? And there are parts of the country where it's used interchangeably, and there are huge parts of the country where only one is acceptable. Another one is the difference between the word route and route. Route 18, Route 611, Route 611. Again, it varies from place to place, and some groups use both interchangeably. I can use both interchangeably. I'm from that part of the world. But when I'm using it as a verb, I only use the word route. We talk about the post office routing a package. We don't talk about them routing a package. This one is really interesting. This is the word caught, C-O-T, and caught, C-A-U-G-H-T. Now, where I grew up, they are said precisely the same way, caught and caught. But you go to the Deep South, and you get very different pronunciations. And you go to New Jersey, and you get very different pronunciations. And you go to New York, and you get different pronunciations. But they're different for different reasons and in different ways. This one makes me nuts. Okay, just saying. I know that a kind of nut that we make into a pie is called pecan. But I'm in the minority in this part of the world where most people will call it pecan. Then there are those who call it pecan and those who call it pecan. 4 different pronunciations depending on where you are in the country. It's a little nuts. And this one I have great trouble with. I can't even differentiate. I can hear the differences, but I can't say the differences between Mary, M-A-R-Y, Mary, M-A-R-R-Y, and Mary, M-E-R-R-Y. So there's a funny story about this. My wife was taking Linguistics 101, and the professor wrote those 3 words on the board and asked for a volunteer in the class to read them. She raised her hand, he called on her, she read them in 3 very different ways, and the professor took 4 steps back and said, "You are from the tri-state region," because that is the only part of the country that differentiates all 3 of them. There are parts of the country where M-A-R-Y and M-A-R-R-Y are said the same way, but M-E-R-R-Y is said differently. And there are other places where M-A-R-R-Y and M-E-R-R-Y are said the same, but M-A-R-Y is said differently. And I can't make the distinctions. I can't pronounce them differently. That's one of those little windows that closed in my head. I have tried for years to do it. I still can't do it. These kinds of lines that you draw to separate one language pronunciation from another, those are called isoglosses. So this is a chart that shows the US. There's approximately 24 broad categories of pronunciation. But within each of these, there are going to be smaller isoglosses. For example, New York City has 5 or 6 all by itself. The pronunciation in Brooklyn is not the same as the pronunciation in the Bronx, and Staten Island is completely on its own, unrelated to any of the others. The Upper West Side differs from the Lower East Side. So the US, this gigantic landmass, has 24 broad categories. And I know that may sound like a lot, but take a look at Britain, which is much smaller in size geographically, but has, brace yourself, 43 broad categories. And here again, this doesn't tell the whole story. London, for example, has 6 or 7 different pronunciations, different isoglosses just within the city. How things are said in Whitechapel are not the same as how they're said in Whitehall. So the slowest change in language happens to be grammar. It also happens to be the most profound. We no longer use the grammar that Shakespeare did, even though Shakespeare is considered early modern English. We don't have these and thous any longer in the English language. We don't use the grammar the same way. And this is my proof that I am finally of the older generation, because this is the one that's making me crazy. This started off in advertising. Less fat, less sugar, less calories. Should be fewer calories. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard when I hear this. It started off in advertising and now it's everywhere. I hear erudite journalists saying it. I hear professors say this kind of thing. The word fewer seems to be moving out of the English language. I don't know if that will stick, but that's what is currently happening. And so this brings us to the last of our questions, and that is the choice of preposition. Which pronoun do you use? Our final survey. You're standing in a grocery store, you're waiting to get to the cash register, there's a group of people in front of you. Are you standing online or are you standing in line? Interestingly enough, 18% of you said online, 82% of you said in line, even though New York and New Jersey and a little bit of Eastern Pennsylvania are clearly in the online category, but apparently not most of the folks in our survey. And this then brings us to the question of the future. It's always dangerous to make predictions about the future where language is concerned. I will say that all of the predictions that were made about English when I was younger have failed miserably to come true. Prediction number 1 at the time was, we were told that TV and satellite communications would flatten the pronunciation of English in America and in England. And in fact, the exact opposite has happened. It's actually exacerbated them. It hasn't eliminated them for sure. Texas still sounds like Texas. Alabama still sounds like Alabama. New York still sounds like New York. Hasn't made a bit of a change. And Britain, again, you go to different parts of London, you will hear the language spoken differently. So those regional pronunciations did not go away. We were told that people were lazy in their speech. That is true. That is why language changes. But because of that, words would get shorter. And the great example of the time was that za was the word used for pizza. Well, nobody says za anymore. It's one of those things that left. If these kinds of things had held true, groovy would still be a word that was acceptable, and so would grody. And neither of them are words that have stuck in the English language. So it's very dangerous to make predictions about where a language is going to go, but I'll give it a little try. My prediction is that new words will enter the language, lots of new words, and a lot of it will come from immigration. We're already seeing it. We have a lot of words that have come into English from Spanish. As we get lots of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent and East Asia, we're going to see more of those words entering the English language. Currently, we are talking about world Englishes. Now, this is a new concept. It's because English is an international language, and there are now more English speakers worldwide than any other single language. But the English spoken in India is very different from the English spoken in Korea, which is different from the English spoken in Africa. And these languages will begin to have an influence, I think, on the language of America and England, in the same way that Australian English has had an influence on our language. I think there will continue to be grammatical changes. I think, like I said, fewer is going away. We'll see if that sticks. I do think that dialects will continue to hold in the US and in other English-speaking countries because we have incredible television and we've had it for 50 years already and it hasn't impacted those dialects. So I think they're pretty much here to stay, at least for the time being. And my final prediction is that all of the changes in this healthy language that we have, that is constantly changing, all of those changes will continue to make English teachers completely crazy. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Well, we do. We have one quick one, and then
Okay.
I think we have to wrap up. So we'll try to hit this one very quickly. Is English in the US and Britain unique in adaptation and different pronunciation? And there's more to this. What about other languages in other countries? Aren't there many dialects, for instance, in China of what we might call Chinese, for example, Mandarin? Do you see a similar dynamic in other countries and other languages as you have presented here?
Absolutely. The German spoken in southern Germany is different from the German spoken in Berlin. And they're both different from the German spoken in Switzerland. My sister was a student in Basel and she talked about Baseldeutsch, which is a very different kind of German than is understood in Berlin, for example. In southern Germany, the pronunciation is softer. So that CH that we know as a hard Ch, that's northern, that's Berlin, that is not the southern part of the country. So yeah, there are differences in every country and in every language. Read me the first part of the question again.
Okay, you got it. Let's see. Is English in the US and Britain unique in adaptation and different pronunciation? What about other languages in other countries?
Okay, so the answer is no, English is not unique. All languages do this. We know that even languages in little teeny tiny countries like ancient Israel, there were differences in pronunciation. We have proof of that in the biblical text. In the book of Judges, we know that some people said things one way, other people said things another way. It got them into great trouble. We know that that even the spelling was different in Hebrew in ancient times. That the word yayin, for example, wine, was spelled with 2 yuds in Judea and 1 yud in the northern part. So yeah, those changes are universal. Every language has it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, at this time, I would really like to thank all of you for joining us, and a big thank you to Dina Mabin for her engaging presentation about the English language. You will receive a link to this presentation in the next several days. You please join us next month on Tuesday, August 20th, for the last episode of our series. Dr. Paul Finkelman, the president of Gratz College, will discuss baseball and the rule of law. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time.